Hi everyone, there's been some changes to APA style, and we are now using the 7th edition of the APA style book. So I'd like to go over those changes with you right now.
So here are the changes to the 7th edition of the APA Style Guide. You are no longer using the old 6th edition from 2009 and now will be required to use the 7th edition that came out in October. There's better guidelines for citing online media in the new version. There's updated guidelines for inclusive and bias-free language. There's a new student-specific paper format, and there's minor changes in how to cite sources. So let's start there. With references and in-text citation, there are 7 notable changes. The first one being that you no longer need the publisher's location in your reference entry. So you just need the actual publisher's name. So you're going to do your reference entry with the author, the year, the title of the book, and then the publisher. No location. In-text citations can now be shortened. So instead of listing the 4 authors of the piece, you're going to just use the first author's last name with et al, period, comma, and the year. So make note of that. If your reference, the resource that you are using has 20 authors attached to it, in your reference entry, you can list up to 20 authors. If you have more than 20 authors on one resource, you can list the first 19, then use an ellipsis, and then use the last author. DOIs are now formatted as just URLs, so you no longer need the letters DOI colon. When citing web pages, you no longer need retrieved from, but you do need to italicize the title of the web page. When citing ebooks, you no longer need to list the format like bracket Kindle edition. So instead, just treat it like an actual book, but with the DOI and the URL for the ebook. When you have contributors that are not really authors, they are included as authors in the following types of media. So for a film, your author would be the director. For TV series, the author would be the executive producers. For a podcast episode, the author would be the host of that episode. For a webinar, it's the instructor. For online streaming video, it's the person or group who uploaded the video. And for a photograph, the author is the photographer. Inclusive and bias-free language has some updates to its guidelines. So you're no longer using the he/she, he or she. Instead, you're using the singular they. So instead of each examiner submitted his or her assessment, you are now going to use each examiner submitted their assessment. You also want to be sensitive to labels, especially when you're grouping an entire group of people together. So instead of referencing people living below the poverty level as the poor, you're instead going to say people living in poverty. Instead of grouping all transgender people as transsexuals, you're going to be specific and be sensitive to the labels. They're transgender people. You also want to be specific. So instead of saying your demographic is all people over 65, you're instead going to be appropriate, give it that appropriate level of specificity and say people age 65 to 75. You also want to be sensitive to how you group people from a continent. So don't clump all the people from Asia together in one group, specifically name their countries and the of those participants. All right, this one you're going to probably like. The paper formatting for students has changed. You have more fonts to choose from. So instead of just being in 12-point Times New Roman, but that is my preference, I like that one the best, you can use Arial, Georgia, Calibri, and Lucida Sans in these specific font sizes. There's no more running head on the paper. So you don't have to worry about the running head unless your professor asks you to put a running head on it. You no longer need the words running head colon. They've also updated the heading styles for more readability. So you can see with levels 3, 4, and 5, there's been some changes with indents and italics. So pay attention to those. And those are the most notable changes in the 7th edition of the APA Style Guide. If you have any questions about anything I covered, feel free to reach out to me at any time or contact the Full Sail Writing Center through the Copilot Center on Full Sail One.